Angela Morris was a convicted killer on death row. Mark Ellison was the trusted guard assigned to keep order, and Officer Reyes was the enforcer feared by every inmate. But when Angela was found pregnant inside a maximum security prison, the secret that tied them together set the stage for a murder. The cameras were never meant to record. Angela Morris had grown up in a small rural town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets never stayed hidden for long. She had been a bright student in school, the kind of person teachers expected to see succeed. But her life took a sharp turn in her early 20s when she became involved with a man who had a history of crime. That relationship, marked by constant trouble and whispered warnings from neighbors, eventually led to her arrest. The case that put her behind bars was brutal. 2 people had been found dead in a burned-down home, and investigators claimed Angela had set the fire to cover up the killings. Whether out of misplaced trust, bad luck, or genuine guilt, she was convicted and sentenced to death. The media descended on the trial, fascinated by her composed demeanor. Newspapers gave her a nickname that stuck, the Angel of Ashes. By the time she arrived at the women's maximum security prison, the case had already become a public obsession. There were those who believed she was a cold-blooded killer, and others who swore she had been framed. Angela herself rarely spoke about the past. Inmates who tried to provoke her were met with silence. She kept to herself, reading library books, writing in a small notebook, and walking laps in the prison yard when it was her turn outside. Guards noticed she never caused trouble, never asked for favors, and never seemed to get too close to anyone. Life on death row was quiet but suffocating. Angela's cell was a narrow space with a concrete bed, a thin mattress, and a small barred window too high to see through. The fluorescent lights never fully went off, making it hard to tell night from day. Meals were passed through a slot in the door, and conversations with other inmates happened in murmurs through the walls. For most people in her position, the days blurred into one long stretch toward an inevitable end, but Angela seemed to carry herself with a strange calm, as if she were waiting for something. Over the years, the public's fascination faded. Other trials, other scandals, replaced her story in the headlines. Only a few true crime enthusiasts kept following her case, posting old newspaper clippings online and arguing over her guilt or innocence. Inside the prison, she became just another name on the death row roster. Even the guards stopped paying her much attention. But there was still an air of mystery about her, a feeling that she knew something others didn't. No one could have predicted how quickly that quiet routine would shatter. The truth about Angela Morris's final months would ignite a scandal bigger than her original trial, one that would raise more questions than it answered. At the time, though, she remained just the woman in cell 14B, the so-called Angel of Ashes, counting down the days until her execution date was set. What happened next would prove that even in the most controlled environment, secrets have a way of breaking free. The discovery came without warning. It was a routine medical check. Nothing unusual, just part of the standard procedure for all inmates. Every few months, Angela had been called to the infirmary, where blood samples were taken and vitals checked. The nurse on duty followed protocol, moving efficiently through the list of patients. When Angela's blood work returned the next day, something in the results made the nurse pause. A pregnancy test had been included in the panel, as was standard for women of childbearing age, though it was more of a formality in a place where opportunities for conception were virtually non-existent. Yet, against all expectation, the test was positive. The nurse checked and rechecked the file, making sure there hadn't been a mix-up with another inmate's samples. But the identifying information was clear. Angela Morris was pregnant. The news traveled up the chain of command quickly, landing on the warden's desk within hours. In a maximum security prison, especially one housing death row inmates, such a revelation was more than a medical matter. It was a crisis. Angela had been incarcerated for over 4 years, confined to an environment with no contact with male inmates, no conjugal visits, and under constant supervision. The idea that she could be pregnant was, on the surface, impossible. The warden's first reaction was disbelief, followed by suspicion. The possibilities were few, and none of them reflected well on the prison administration. If Angela's pregnancy was the result of a consensual relationship, it would point to severe breaches in security. If it was the result of coercion or assault, the implications were far darker. Either way, the situation had to be contained. The fewer people who knew, the better, at least until they could figure out what had happened. An internal investigation was launched immediately. Security footage from Angela's cell block, recreation areas, and work assignments over the past 6 months was pulled for review. Teams of staff sat through hours of recordings, searching for anything unusual, an unmonitored encounter, a missing guard from their post, or unexplained entries into her cell. What they found was baffling. Most of the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, but here and there, brief moments were missing, small gaps of a few minutes, as if the cameras had glitched. The technical staff claimed it was likely due to equipment issues, but the timing of these gaps raised eyebrows. Inside the prison walls, whispers began to circulate. Rumors have a way of moving faster than official statements. And before long, many of the inmates knew Angela was pregnant. Some speculated that she had managed to smuggle in a lover during visitation hours, an impossible feat in such a secure facility. Others claimed a guard was responsible. A few insisted it was part of a bizarre deal to save her from execution. Angela herself offered no explanation. She attended her medical appointments without protest, speaking only when addressed, her expression giving nothing away. But the silence around her was far from peaceful. Unknown to her, powerful people inside the prison were already weighing their options, not about protecting her, but about ensuring the truth never left those walls. As the investigation deepened, patterns began to emerge from the sea of surveillance logs and duty rosters. One name kept appearing more often than the others: Mark Ellison, a correctional officer with nearly a decade of service. His personnel file painted the picture of a model employee: steady attendance, positive evaluations, and no official complaints. But when investigators overlaid his shift schedules with the missing camera footage, the coincidences became harder to ignore. Ellison had been on duty during nearly every instance where recordings mysteriously cut out. What stood out even more was his unusual presence in Angela's vicinity. Though assigned to a different section of the facility, he had been recorded entering her cell block multiple times without a clear reason. These visits were never logged, which meant they violated protocol. When questioned, Ellison remained calm, insisting that he had been performing spot checks or delivering messages from administration. His tone was confident, but his explanations didn't match the official record. While the administration quietly tried to determine if Ellison was the father of Angela's unborn child, other pieces of the puzzle began to surface. A review of Angela's cell turned up several scraps of paper tucked into the pages of a book she kept on her bed. The handwriting was neat but hurried, and each note carried the same chilling tone: warnings to keep your mouth shut and don't say his name. One, written in ink that had bled slightly on the paper, was more direct: you know what will happen if you talk. The threats were not part of any official communication, meaning they had been smuggled in. Given Angela's restricted contact with the outside world, the likeliest source was someone within the prison staff. That possibility deepened the sense of danger. She was in a place where her safety depended entirely on the very people who might be responsible for her pregnancy. Meanwhile, Angela's demeanor began to shift. She was still quiet, still careful with her words, but there were moments when her eyes followed certain guards longer than others, her expression unreadable. Fellow inmates noticed she avoided the yard during certain shifts and skipped meals if certain staff members were on duty. To them, this wasn't the behavior of someone simply trying to stay out of trouble. It was the behavior of someone who knew trouble was unavoidable. Behind closed doors, the prison's leadership faced a choice: escalate the investigation and risk public exposure, or contain it and hope the problem went away. The latter seemed safer. Ellison was left on duty, though his assignments were quietly shifted to other areas. But this change came too late. The atmosphere around Angela had already turned threatening. Her pregnancy wasn't just a scandal waiting to erupt. It was a secret tangled in power, reputation, and fear, and those who wanted it buried would stop at nothing to make sure she stayed silent. Angela's final day began like any other, but under the surface there was a quiet tension in the air. Her pregnancy was now 6 months along, and the prison's medical staff had recommended moving her to a secure medical wing for closer monitoring. Officially, it was to ensure the health of both mother and child. Unofficially, it was a way to limit her contact with the general prison population and keep her under constant watch. The warden approved the transfer without delay. That evening, just before lights out, 2 correctional officers arrived at her cell. They instructed her to gather her few personal belongings, her notebook, a folded sweater, and a paperback novel. The move was recorded by hallway cameras, which captured Angela walking between the 2 guards down the long corridor toward the medical wing. Her pace was slow, deliberate, as though she sensed something about this relocation was not entirely about her health. The last clear footage of her alive showed her stepping into the infirmary hallway. From that point onward, official record claimed the cameras malfunctioned. In reality, there was a 27-minute blackout, a gap far too specific to be dismissed as random technical failure. When the feed resumed, Angela was no longer in the hallway. A quiet alarm spread among the staff. She had not been checked into the medical wing, nor was she in her assigned holding room. The prison immediately entered a partial lockdown. Guards began sweeping every floor, every storage closet, and every maintenance area. It was in the laundry room, deep in a restricted section of the facility, that they found her body. Angela lay on the cold concrete floor, her wrists bruised and her neck marked by deep, dark ligature impressions. Her swollen abdomen was stiff. Medical staff quickly confirmed both she and the unborn child were dead. There was no sign of a struggle beyond a few overturned laundry bins, suggesting she had been overpowered quickly. The discovery was handled with a strange efficiency. The scene was cordoned off, but not for long. Within hours, the area was sanitized, and any physical traces that might have told the story of what happened were removed. Official statements described her death as a result of an altercation, leaving out key details about her pregnancy and the camera blackout. Among the few staff who knew the truth, there was no open discussion. Only curt instructions to stick to the official version. Even those who had no part in the crime understood the risk of speaking out. Angela's death was not just the end of a condemned inmate's life. It was the erasure of a dangerous secret that could have unraveled the careers of several people in power. What none of them realized was that not all the cameras had failed. Somewhere in the depths of the prison's backup systems, pieces of that missing 27 minutes still existed, grainy, incomplete, but enough to reveal that her final moments had been far from a spontaneous act of violence. The official narrative claimed the surveillance system had suffered a rare, unexplained malfunction, erasing nearly half an hour of footage from multiple cameras. But deep inside the prison's IT department, a backup server quietly stored fragmented copies of the missing recordings. These files were not part of the main network, and were usually ignored unless a full system restore was necessary. A junior technician, curious about the blackout, decided to check them. What emerged was not a complete sequence, but enough to fill in the silence surrounding Angela's last moments. The footage was grainy, the lighting harsh, but the shapes and movements were unmistakable. 3 figures entered the laundry room during the blackout. The first was clearly identifiable as Mark Ellison, the guard whose name had already been tied to Angela through suspicious visits and the unlogged entries into her cell block. His tall frame and distinct gait matched perfectly with earlier recordings. The second was a woman in uniform, Officer Reyes, known among the inmates for her strict, sometimes aggressive demeanor. Angela had clashed with her before, though the reasons for their tension were never officially documented. The third figure was harder to confirm. The camera angle caught only a partial profile, and the faint outline of a uniform with rank insignia on the shoulder. From the positioning and height, the silhouette could only belong to someone of higher authority, possibly the deputy warden. The video showed Ellison and Reyes closing the laundry room door behind them. Angela was already inside, seated on a bench against the wall, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She stood when they approached, but her posture wasn't confrontational. It was wary, almost resigned. The unidentified third figure remained near the door, watching. Then in a swift movement, Reyes stepped forward, shoving Angela back toward the bench. Ellison moved in immediately, pinning her shoulders while Reyes pulled something from her belt. An object the camera resolution couldn't clearly define, but its use soon became apparent. Angela's body jerked as pressure was applied to her neck. Her hands clawed at the bench for balance, then at Ellison's sleeve before her movement slowed and eventually stopped. The entire struggle lasted less than a minute. The figure stood over her for several seconds. Then the third person approached. Their face never turned toward the camera. But they bent down, checking for signs of life before giving what appeared to be a nod. Angela's limp body was left where it had fallen. The three exited in the same order they had entered, the door closing quietly behind them. The technician who found this footage immediately understood its value and its danger. The images not only proved Angela had been murdered, but also implicated prison staff in a coordinated act. Yet within hours of the discovery, word reached upper management, and the technician was instructed to delete every trace of the file. Unbeknownst to them, he made a private copy before complying, storing it on an encrypted drive. That single decision would ensure the truth had a chance to resurface. Just not yet. The days following Angela's death were marked by an eerie calm inside the prison, as if everyone had silently agreed to carry on as though nothing unusual had happened. Official memos labeled the incident as an inmate altercation, resulting in fatality, and any mention of her pregnancy was scrubbed from internal reports. But small cracks in the cover-up began to appear almost immediately, and they started with a missing piece of paper. Angela had kept a small notebook, usually filled with quotes from books or fragments of thoughts written in tiny, neat handwriting. After her death, the prison's evidence team collected it along with her other belongings, but one page was gone. A page her cellmate later claimed Angela had been writing on the day before her transfer to the medical wing. According to this inmate, Angela had been preparing a letter for her attorney, one that would explain how she became pregnant and name the people involved. The page was missing when her possessions were inventoried, and no one could explain what had happened to it. While administration tried to maintain control over the narrative, the investigation was far from airtight. Some guards were quietly questioned by outside law enforcement, and phone records became a point of interest. That's when another troubling link emerged. A series of late-night calls between Mark Ellison and the deputy warden, spaced over several weeks and coinciding with the gaps in surveillance footage. The content of those calls couldn't be recovered, but the timing was enough to raise suspicion among the few investigators willing to look deeper. Officer Reyes became another problem. She had been one of the last people seen escorting Angela before the blackout, and her record wasn't spotless. She had been disciplined in the past for aggressive behavior toward inmates. When whispers of her possible involvement reached her, she didn't wait for formal questioning. Instead, she resigned abruptly, leaving her uniform and ID badge in her locker. Her departure was officially described as personal leave, but the speed of her exit told a different story. The combination of missing evidence, questionable resignations, and suspicious communication patterns made it increasingly difficult to sustain the official account. Still, the prison leadership seemed determined to suppress the truth. Staff who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned to less favorable shifts, and outside agencies faced sudden bureaucratic delays when requesting records. It was a calculated strategy, dragged the process out until interest faded. Despite these efforts, a small but growing circle of people inside and outside the prison suspected Angela's death had been orchestrated. The motives varied depending on who was asked to silence her about the pregnancy, to protect reputations, to cover up a deeper network of corruption. But all those theories shared one common thread. Angela had known something that certain people could not risk being revealed. And in the carefully managed world of prison politics, that kind of knowledge was more dangerous than any weapon. Her death wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a secret war over whether the truth would ever see daylight. Mark Ellison's arrest was meant to be the moment justice began, but it quickly became clear that the case would never make it that far. His detainment followed weeks of mounting suspicion, fueled by the leaked whispers of his connection to Angela and the unexplained presence of his name in security logs during the blackout. For a brief period, it seemed like accountability might finally reach inside the prison walls. The media caught wind of his arrest, and headlines hinted at a scandal involving the death of a pregnant death row inmate. But the momentum didn't last. From the start, the prosecution faced obstacles. Witnesses who had initially seemed willing to cooperate suddenly changed their stories or stopped responding altogether. One guard, who had privately admitted to seeing Ellison in the restricted area near the laundry room, recanted during a formal interview, claiming they must have been mistaken. Another potential witness was transferred to a different facility before they could be questioned again, and efforts to contact them afterward were met with dead ends. It became obvious to those watching closely that a coordinated effort was underway to shut down the case from multiple angles. The most damaging blow came when the backup surveillance footage vanished. The IT technician who had discovered it was called into a closed-door meeting with high-ranking officials. By the time he emerged, the files were gone, overwritten by what was labeled a routine server update. Publicly, the prison claimed no such footage had ever existed, and without it, the prosecution's most compelling evidence was reduced to rumor. Meanwhile, Ellison's defense team moved aggressively, painting him as a scapegoat for broader failings within the prison system. They argued that the administration had allowed security breaches to occur and was now trying to pin all the blame on a single officer to protect itself from lawsuits. Without physical evidence or cooperative witnesses, the case against him unraveled faster than it had formed. Within 3 months, the charges were quietly dropped. In the midst of this collapse, other key figures slipped away from scrutiny. The warden announced an abrupt retirement, citing family health concerns, though former staff claimed he had been offered a generous severance package contingent on his silence. The deputy warden, whose shadowy presence in the grainy footage had never been officially confirmed, was transferred to a different facility hundreds of miles away. Promoted to a higher administrative role, Officer Reyes, long gone by that point, had vanished entirely from public record. When the dust settled, the official file on Angela Morris's death contained only a short summary. Fatal incident between inmates, no staff involvement. There was no mention of her pregnancy, no record of the investigation's inconsistencies, and no acknowledgement of the blackout. For the public, the story faded as quickly as it had surfaced, drowned out by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But for those who knew the truth, or at least enough of it to see through the lies, her death was more than an unsolved crime. It was proof of how deeply corruption could root itself in an institution, and how easily the lives of the powerless could be erased when they threatened the powerful. Angela's voice had been silenced, but the secret she carried was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. Years passed before the truth clawed its way back to the surface. By then, Angela Morris's name had largely vanished from public conversation. Her case was remembered only by a handful of true crime enthusiasts who occasionally debated her innocence on obscure online forums. The official record still described her death as the result of an inmate altercation, and the circumstances of her pregnancy were buried so deep that even investigative journalists hit brick walls when trying to uncover them. It seemed as though her story had been successfully erased, until a single piece of evidence re-emerged. The source was unexpected, a retired prison IT technician, long removed from the politics and fear that had once kept him quiet. In the final weeks before leaving his job, he had secretly copied the fragment of backup footage showing Angela's murder, storing it on an encrypted drive and locking it away. For years, he told no one, fearing retaliation from those still in power. But with retirement came distance, and with distance came a sense of obligation. He decided to leak the video anonymously, uploading it to a file-sharing site and sending the link to several independent journalists known for exposing institutional corruption. Within hours of the upload, the footage spread across social media. Grainy though it was, the images were damning. The three figures could be seen entering the laundry room: Mark Ellison, Officer Reyes, and the shadowy third figure, almost certainly the deputy warden. Angela's posture, her protective hold on her abdomen, the speed of the attack, it all played out in sickening clarity. Viewers watched as she was restrained, her life violently taken, and the silent nod of approval given before the attackers left her lifeless on the floor. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Hashtags bearing Angela's name trended for days. News outlets picked up the story, many expressing outrage that such a crime could occur inside a state-run facility and be covered up for so long. Activists demanded a full reopening of the investigation, and state officials faced pressure to explain how those involved had escaped justice. Under this renewed scrutiny, law enforcement reluctantly reopened the case. But the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable met the same wall of resistance it had years earlier. Ellison, Reyes, and the deputy warden were gone, vanished from their last known addresses, leaving no clear trail. Officially, they were listed as unreachable, though some suspected they had been deliberately protected. Witnesses who might have testified again refused to speak, citing fear for their safety. Even so, the leak had changed something fundamental. Angela's story was no longer just a sealed file in a dusty archive. It was a rallying cry. Documentaries were produced, advocacy groups added her name to their campaigns, and her image appeared on protest signs outside courthouses. The final frame of the footage, where Angela's eyes lock on the camera moments before her death, became iconic. Though her killers remained free, the world now knew what had been hidden. The truth, once buried under layers of lies